Welcome to BMV Manhwa, your favorite place to watch manhwas. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy the content.
As Alice agreed to let Art read the book, she thought that she wasn't a doting mother, but the child's age needed to play a lot, and she baby-proofed the room. Art thought that he wasn't demeaning and a great warrior must have utilized all weapons in his arsenal. She then kept looking at him, and just as she heard the sound of something getting crashed, she told Art that she would come soon and his father had better not have knocked down one more tree. Art saw her going outside and thought that his biggest accomplishment, aside from the accumulated knowledge of that world, was his progress in forming a many-mana core. He then got to meditate and thought that he had spent those sky 2 years moving tens of thousands of tiny fragments of mana inside his body and gathering them together near his solar plexus. And he could see why that would take until adolescence to form naturally, and seeing how slow those fragments gravitated towards the center of his body. As he was meditating, that was an arduous task both for his body and mind, but those 2 years weren't going to be wasted. And he was almost done with that. Outside, his father really broke one more tree, and his mother was laughing. As the both of the two white things got combined, a huge blast was made in his house. Reynolds rushed to cover Alice. As Reynolds covered Alice, the blast hit his back badly. He asked if she was fine. She replied that Art was still in the house. Upon hearing that, Reynolds rushed towards the house, and as he cleared his way to get inside, he was shocked to see something there and knelt down. As Alice arrived, she asked what happened there. Reynolds replied that it might be kidding, because Art wasn't yet 3 years old, but he was able to use magic by himself and was floating in the air. By using that, Art stayed safe, and as he came down and felt relaxed, he sensed the mana core around himself. He even saw the trees getting greener. As he realized he was looking at the trees, he looked around and was shocked to see the destruction there. He wondered if they were attacked and who would dare to attack the house of a king. After everything returned to normal, in the past year his mother had been teaching him how to write and read. He was also learning the basics of mana manipulation and augmentation. Initially, his body was too small to sparkle, so he did basic body workouts with his father like running, curl-ups and push-ups. It wasn't too long ago when his father finally decided that he would be fine for practice. So, on his 3rd birthday, while he was reading a book alone, his father came and showed that he had brought a wooden sword for Art, saying, "Let's get to training." His father came in such a rush that some papers flew away and spread around. Reynolds took Art outside of the house and reminded him of what he had taught Art, instructing him to match the flow of mana with his breathing like his heart or lungs. His core was a different organ. Reynolds also had a wooden stick in his hand. Art wondered if a 4-year-old child would understand those instructions. After that, he practiced with his sword by striking it with the stick held by his father. After a lot of slashing, Reynolds encouraged Art that he could do it. Art thought that Reynolds was not going to let him rest until he did it, and he only had a few moments to study before dinner. He concentrated, and as he slashed, Reynolds' stick broke and fell at a distance. Then Art asked his father if he could study. As his father agreed, Art began to meditate and thought about how in that world, strength was measured by the color of one's mana core. They started off black due to the body's impurities mixing with mana particles to form the core. Over time, the core became more pure as impurities were filtered out, with the order going as follows: black, red, orange, yellow, silver, and white. Each stage had 3 shades: dark, light, and solid. The lighter the mana core, the purer and more powerful it was. Suddenly, Alice called him for dinner, distracting Art. As they all had dinner, Art wondered if a small child could get some free time to learn and how else he was supposed to learn. Alice suggested that it was time to hire a proper mentor for Art. Alive and Reynolds got into an argument on that topic. Alive argued that Art was only 4 years old and besides, Reynolds had taken the responsibility to teach him. Reynolds replied that he never expected Art to be such a prodigy in manipulation at just 4 years old. He felt he was holding Art back, but Art had a lot of potential. Alive said she wasn't comfortable with her child leaving home to go to a city that was hundreds of miles away. Reynolds argued that Cyrus wasn't just any city, he had a friend there who would take good care of Art as well. After some heated arguments, they slammed their hands on the table, and Reynolds asked Art if he wanted to go to a big city to get a real teacher. Art thought they were asking too much of a 4-year-old to decide. He then asked if they couldn't come too and meet the teacher together. They both looked at each other. Art wondered if he had said something wrong and made things too complicated. But then his parents laughed, and his father said they hadn't really thought about all of them going together. Alive said she felt better about being there when Art was tested and met his teacher. Reynolds slammed the table and declared that it seemed like they were all going to Cyrus City. Art was shocked to overhear his parents already preparing for the 3-week journey. He then resumed reading the book and reached the page where he had left off. Just then, Alice came and took the book from Art, telling him that he needed to go to bed because they were heading to the city early the next morning. Art replied that it all seemed to be happening so fast. Alive mentioned that she hated rushing like that too, but their friends from the Twin Horns were also going to Cyrus, so they were taking them along and Reynolds was currently with them. She then gave him a forehead kiss and, while leaving, suggested to him not to start reading again and to also bring some books with him on his trip, so for that time he had to sleep. He agreed, and then Alice greeted him and closed the door. Art thought that he knew the Twin Horns had been in the area for a while, and had even been helping to rebuild their home when they had the time. And from what he had heard, the party consisted of 2 conjurers and 3 augments. That would help with whatever troubles they might run into. He was finally moving on from that small, quiet town. That was the time to see what the world truly had to offer. The next morning they left their home, and while walking, they met Reynolds' friend. As Reynolds hugged him, he thanked his friend for taking them on the trip. Reynolds then invited them to meet his son, and then Art introduced himself. Art bowed and, while saying his name, he thanked the fellas for coming with them to Cyrus. Fellas moved his hand over Art and said that he had good manners, then asked Art if he was sure Reynolds was his father. Just then Rose, Fella's wife, lifted Art and hugged him, commenting that he was too precious and looked like her mother. Art wondered what was going on with him and found it hard to breathe. Durden told Rose that she was hurting him, then lifted Art in his hand. Durden was a giant man. He then placed Art on the ground. Art saw Jasmine sitting silently there, and as she stood and walked away, Helen came to Art. Art was still looking at Jasmine, and Helen told Art that he didn't have to mind her, as she just needed to get used to Art. Helen then introduced herself, extending her hand towards Art and commenting that it was nice to meet him. Durden announced to everyone that they should get acquainted and prepare to leave from there. They then loaded all the things into the carriage. Fellas asked if everything was fine at the back. Rose replied that they were all good. Fellas then suggested they get going. There were 2 carts from which they were departing. Art, looking back, thought that his journey had finally begun. As the journey progressed, night fell, and they encountered some monsters that they killed and brought back to the bonfire to cook for food. As they all sat around the fire, Helen asked Art if he was tired, but he reassured her that he didn't have to worry about that, as it was his first time traveling like this. Art replied that he guessed so and then stretched his hand. Helen mentioned to him that his father had been bragging nearly the entire way there, claiming he was a genius mage, and asked Art if he really awakened a year ago. They continued their conversation. Just then, Fellas stood up and told Reynolds that he was going to do some stretching before going to sleep. Reynolds had mentioned earlier that he had been sparring with Art, so he asked if Fellas minded joining in with Art. Art wondered if Fellas would stretch out by himself. Reynolds cautioned Fellas to be careful, as they had barely moved from light strength and the exercises could be intense. Fellas came over and lifted Art, taking him away from there. Art thought that normal kids his age could barely climb a flight of stairs, but he guessed no one thought it unusual to spar with him. Fellas took Art for a sword battle and asked if he was ready. Art stretched his hand and Fellas asked if he knew how to reinforce his weapon. Art let out a roar like a tiger. Looking at Reynold, Art felt they were communicating telepathically as father and son. Art thought that Fellas seemed ready for a serious fight, so he tried to get out of that situation. However, Reynold appeared to be encouraging Art to do his best. Art thought it was pointless and decided to use skills from his previous life. He ran and launched an attack on Fellas, who defended himself and pushed Art back. Art felt frustrated with his inexperienced body. Despite attempting to attack Fellas again and again, he kept getting dodged until finally, after some time, their swords clashed. Art thought that in that town, Newton's third law of motion applied in his mind, causing him to fall to the ground. Alice seemed worried about him. Art wondered if Fellas' opposite reaction had hurt. As Art stood up, Durden slapped the back of Fellas' head and commented that it was too hard for such a small kid. Fellas asked Reynold if he hadn't taught that to Art and what kind of hellish training he had put him through to create such a little monster. Reynold replied that he hadn't taught that to Art. Alice proceeded to heal Art and asked if that was what Art was studying. Art replied that he learned it by watching his father and reading books. Someone mentioned that Art was still going to teach them some of those movement techniques of his. 7 days had passed since they started their journey to the city of Osiris. One morning, they were bathing near a waterfall. Alice was washing Art, and Art thought about how his birthday had also passed during that time, reminding him of the birthday gifts and lessons he had received. They all continued their training with decent progress. While Fellas was in the river, Durden jumped into the water, but he accidentally slipped and, in doing so, created a pressure wave that caused a fish to land on Jasmine's head. Art was surprised to learn that Jasmine had already succeeded in learning some techniques. He marveled at how fast Jasmine was able to grasp his instructions, especially when learning the feint step. Just then, Art saw Reynold running with a bucket containing Durden and Fellas' clothes. After all the fun, they got ready to leave. Alice called Art to get going. As he got into the carriage, they all departed from there.